Hi there, and welcome to this video where we're going to talk about the top 10 most quoted, most referenced people in the Summa Theologica. And I'll start off by saying this is not an exact science. I think it's pretty accurate, but I don't have the exact numbers of how many times these particular men are quoted, but I think it's pretty much on the money as far as how many times St. Thomas Aquinas leans on the expertise of these particular people. And you're going to find that in regard to these 10 men that they are very varied in backgrounds, different faiths, they lived in different times. And so it just goes to show you that St. Thomas Aquinas really just leaned on anybody who had something important to say, regardless of their religious or their philosophical background. So the first of our 10, the 10th most quoted person in the Summa, by my estimation, is Marcus Tullius Cicero, whom St. Thomas Aquinas refers to simply as Tully in the Summa Theologica, 1st century BC Roman statesman. And his kind of claim to fame is that he brought Greek philosophy to the Latin-speaking world. So he was the one that, of course, a Latin speaker himself, he went and researched the Greek philosophy and then brought it into the Latin world. And so he is quoted quite often by St. Thomas Aquinas. The next one is a Jewish scholar. He's a rabbinical scholar by the name of Rabbi Moses Maimonides. He died in 1204, so he would not have ever lived at the same time as St. Thomas Aquinas, since Aquinas was born approximately 1225, and so they were never alive at the same time. But again, as far as Jewish scholars, this was St. Thomas's go-to guy. The next one is one of two Muslim philosophers that appear on the list, and this is Avicenna, whose Muslim name was Ibn Sina. He was an Aristotelian, Platonic, Islamic philosopher. And it's important to note that Aristotle, who lived in the 4th century BC, was, of course, extremely influential in his time. And then his writings kind of went dark for a while, and they weren't really used. And before Aristotle became a popular source of information for the Christian philosophers in the Middle Ages, like St. Thomas Aquinas, it was the Muslim philosophers who discovered him first, and that's why St. Thomas Aquinas leaned heavily on two, in particular, Muslim philosophers, the first being Avicenna, and he died in 1037, so a couple of centuries before St. Thomas Aquinas arrived on the scene. All right, the next person is Saint John Damascene, who was an Eastern Assyrian Christian monk and priest, lived in the 8th century, died in 749. And as far as Christian influences, there are only a couple of them, as you'll see, who had a greater influence on St. Thomas Aquinas as far as references and quotes in the Summa than Saint John Damascene. Okay, we move on to number 6, and this is our next Muslim philosopher, and this is Avaros, whose real name was Ibn Rushd, Muslim commentator on Aristotle. He lived in the 12th century, died in 1198, so again, he was dead a good 25-30 years before St. Thomas Aquinas was even born, so they weren't contemporaries, but again, the works of Aristotle were really discovered by the Muslim philosophers before they were the Christians, and so I think Aquinas owed a great debt of gratitude to the Islamic philosophers who came before him. Avaros is referred to in the Summa as simply the commentator. So anytime you see the commentator in the Summa, that is who St. Thomas Aquinas is referring to. Now, anytime you hear, and you'll hear this often in the Summa, somebody referred to as the master, it's this person. This is Peterlombard. Peterlombard died in 1160, and the master is his name because he wrote an extremely important book called The Sentences of Peterlombard. And oftentimes you'll hear St. Thomas Aquinas say the master of the sentences. This is Peterlombard. The best way to describe the importance of the sentences is that the sentences in the 12th century was basically the Summa of today. Okay, it was the go-to work for any Christian theologian or philosopher at that time, and so that's why we don't hear about it much anymore, is because now we have the Summa, and the sentences kind of became obsolete in a sense because Thomas wrote a better summary of theology. But back in the day, it was Peterlombard, the master of the sentences, who was extremely important. This person is number 4 on the list, Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite. This, if you read the Summa, you're going to see Dionysius referred to a lot. And there's a little bit of mystery surrounding Dionysius because in Scripture, in Acts 17:34, we see a reference to a Dionysius. And then in the 6th century, you have a philosopher who hits the scene referring to himself as Dionysius. Okay, so people are like, well, who is this? This body of work, is this the 1st century Dionysius or is it the 6th century Dionysius? Nobody really knows. Okay, there's some mystery, and so that's why they refer to it as Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite. And again, in my estimation, the 4th most referenced person in the Summa Theologia. Number 3 is none other than Saint Augustine. Of course, the great Saint Augustine, who lived in the 5th century, 4th and 5th century. He died in 430. It's kind of hard to explain the influence of St. Augustine, not only to St. Thomas Aquinas, but to the Catholic Church in general. He's huge, okay? And really up until the time of St. Thomas Aquinas, Augustine was the theologian in the Catholic Church. And I would say even to this day, if you were to say who are the most influential theologians in the Catholic Church, that list would basically be Aquinas and Augustine, and depending on who you ask, it would be those top 2. But he is referred to primarily as just Augustine in the Summa. Sometimes he'll be referred to as the theologian. And again, hard to overestimate the value of Augustine to St. Thomas Aquinas in writing the Summa Theologia. All right, who is number 2 on the list? None other than Aristotle himself. Aristotle lived in the 4th century BC, died in 322 BC. Of course, a great Greek philosopher. He was the student of Plato and the teacher of Alexander the Great. And St. Thomas Aquinas refers to him in the Summa as the philosopher. In fact, more often referred to as the philosopher than even by his name, Aristotle. Thomas, his great contribution, one of his great contributions to philosophy and theology is taking the works of Aristotle, first discovered, of course, in the Middle Ages by the Muslims, as I mentioned, and then really baptizing it. It was controversial at the time, using a Greek philosopher, but Aquinas saw so much value in it that he said, we can take what's good and then we can incorporate it into the Christian faith, and that's exactly what Aquinas did. So very, very important to the Summa is the philosopher Aristotle, who is great. So now we get to number 1. Who is the most referenced person in the Summa Theologia? Well, maybe you figured it out. It's none other than God himself, okay? But this is through sacred scripture, and so I would put as the human being most referenced, it's scripture itself, but I would say St. Paul is referred to a lot. In fact, he has got a nickname in the Summa. He is the Apostle. And so St. Thomas Aquinas, leaning very, very heavily on scripture, both Old Testament and New Testament, without a doubt, the greatest source of reference and authority in the Summa would be Scripture, which means that God himself is the greatest assistance to St. Thomas Aquinas in writing the Summa. And if I had to just put a single person on it, I would say St. Paul, because he is referenced a lot in the Summa as the Apostle. All right, so there you have it. Those are, in my estimation, the top 10 most quoted people in the Summa Theologia. Let me know what you think, and maybe you disagree in the order, and that's okay, but let me know if you think and if you agree in the order that I gave it. Thank you very much for watching, and may God bless you.